welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
I'm Jen. I am your host today for Turn the Page, and I'm here today with a return guest. Last year, I talked to this guest about a fabulous book, and I am here to discuss another today. So let's get into it. Can I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, Jen. My name's Gill Paul, and I'm a UK-based author of historical novels about women who lived in the first half of the 20th century, who had really fascinating lives that may not have been covered adequately, in my opinion, by historians who've not been given the credit they deserve. And so my new novel, A Beautiful Rival, is about two extraordinary, phenomenal women, Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubenstein, who basically created the modern beauty industry. And what fascinates me about them is that they had a 5 decades long feud. They hated each other. They were in the same industry. They had a lot in common, but they did everything they could to sabotage each other's businesses. And I just thought that was such fun to write about.
It is such a fascinating story because these women had so much in common and, some important differences in their experiences too.
Sure.
And the intensity of the rivalry is, my gosh, it was not just professional. It got very personal, it seems like.
It absolutely did, yes. I mean, it started when Helena arrived in Manhattan in 1914 to look for a salon. And Elizabeth was already established there, and she felt very strongly it was her territory. And Helena came in quite aggressively, setting off on a road tour around the States to persuade department stores to stock her products and telling their assistants how to become Helena Rubenstein women. So she did come in, and taking advertising in all the magazines, and Elizabeth's hackles rose at this. So it began with just planting negative stories in the press, sabotaging advertising campaigns, and then it went to copying each other's products and poaching staff. But it got much darker in the 1930s, and when they were Helena was Jewish, and Elizabeth was hanging out she was dining in Paris with Nazis. And she wasn't strongly political, but she was anti-Semitic in the way that quite a lot of people were of a certain group were in that era. So that really darkened the rivalry between them at that point.
I'm really curious about your shift between projects, because last year we discussed Manhattan Girls, which I loved. Mm-hmm. It was about Dorothy Parker and her circle with the Algonquin group, and to shift to this world, which covers some of the same time period, but also it has a very large scope, so it covers more time periods. So when you were switching gears between projects, what kind of at what point do you decide that a research interest is a novel, if that makes sense?
I've got a file with lots of ideas that have occurred to me or that readers have suggested over the years. I love it when readers get in touch with me and say, why don't you write about XYZ? And I just keep them in a file, and I'll pitch to my editor every year when I finish one contract, and I'll suggest maybe 3, 4, or 5 ideas and see which she thinks is right for the market at that time. Because as well as finding the stories in history and the women that I'm interested in writing about, it's got to have some kind of contemporary relevance that we think people nowadays will want to read about. So yeah, it's a kind of joint process of deciding which idea. For me, the ingredients I'm looking for in a story are just, extraordinary women that I feel have been undervalued in some way. But I want them to be very complex, multifaceted characters as well. Difficult lives, not straightforward. My characters don't tend to marry their childhood sweetheart and stay with them for the rest of their lives, let's just say.
Yeah, very complicated lives and complicated people. And I really appreciate that, the stories find empathy for them, but without filing off their rough edges. They're they are presented in all their sort of messy glory, and I really appreciate that. From the historical aspect, I love that this story gave depth to names, that as an 80s and 90s kids, I only recognized from TV and from salons, like growing up in the 90s, I knew Helena Rubenstein as a funder of public television. Her name would appear
Oh, right.
after every
Yes.
program. And I knew Liz Arden from, the salon that my mom loved to go to. And so when you're a kid, I don't think you really understand that there are histories behind names. And so to sort of get this new context was really fascinating for me. What made you choose the cosmetics industry? Because I find it super fascinating.
Yeah, I didn't specifically choose the cosmetics industry. I was, when I'm looking for ideas, I'll Google somebody that interests me, or I read a lot of biographies. I've always loved reading biographies. And sometimes it's not the person that the biography is of, it's a little footnote at the bottom that leads me off in a completely different direction. And I just sort of follow rabbit holes and research until I find a story that leaps out for me. And with those two, it wasn't the cosmetics so much, although they are extraordinary women, and they haven't really been given credit for the fact that they managed, from no money in their backgrounds at all, no family wealth, no rich husbands, just from scratch, they created these global empires and became self-made millionairesses in an era where there's no way women could get a bank loan. They just couldn't. And they just managed it on opposite sides of the world. Helena in Australia and Elizabeth in Manhattan, and until they came together in 1915 and started clashing. No, it was always the story of the feud that fascinated me. But I did learn a lot about the cosmetics along the way. They created the modern industry. They're the ones. Before them, you had maybe Pond's cold cream, you had rose water, you had glycerin. But they're the ones that started marketing campaigns telling women it was their duty to be beautiful, that, you couldn't have a successful marriage if you didn't take care of your skin, basically. All this messaging that feminists aren't very approving of, when you get to the 70s and 80s. But back then, it was enormously influential.
That is the bit that fascinates me. It's that sort of like that tension between the industry, and I think these women's relationship to it too, being empowering and exploitative, because like it is, the message is like, oh, this will help, it'll help your marriage, it'll help your career, it'll help this, it'll help that. But also it's like feeding on people's insecurities as well, and so I'm really interested in like that sort of psychological dance between these two elements.
Absolutely. I mean, they came along. I mean, they were lucky to come at a point where, first of all, the glossy magazines had started to be produced. Vogue was 1890s, and they could advertise in there. And so that was one step. And the next was the growth of department stores, these vast consumer emporiums where they could display their products and give away free samples and meet their customers face to face. So these two things, but also makeup was becoming more publicly acceptable. I mean, before the 1920s, no decent woman would be seen wearing makeup. That's what was for actresses and prostitutes. But it was partly the silent movie stars with their huge black eyes and dark lips that helped to change that trend. And the flappers as well came along, the younger generation. And gradually Elizabeth and Helena introduced basic kind of skincare, a little bit of lipstick that just gave your lips a healthier glow, and a bit of powder to even out the complexion, and they moved. So they came along just as makeup was becoming publicly acceptable, and that obviously helped their businesses enormously.
So I'm really curious about, when you're writing something like this, maybe like how the roles of historian and the roles of novelist might clash or interact, because when you're writing the story of a bitter rivalry like this, as a historian, if you were telling the story as a historian, your job would be to remain objective and non-judgmental and present it as it happened. But as a novelist, part of your job is to induce empathy in people, and you have to sort of feel that for your characters as well. So when you were writing this story, did you feel yourself tempted to take sides or to identify with one woman more than the other, or sort of what was your like relationship to the characters as you were writing it?
I always felt very strongly myself that I felt very sorry for both of them. I think Elizabeth was just about the loneliest person in the world, but she was her own worst enemy as well, because she you know, she was such a snob, and that's just not a likable quality at all. And she alienated people with that. And also, you know, the anti-Semitism is difficult for people in our generation to identify with and to like her for it. But she was doing what a lot of people did in that day. Helena as well, she was a workaholic. She never, ever stopped. You know, her correspondence with her husband in Paris when their marriage was on the rocks. And she said, I just work and work and work. I've worked since I was 18 years old, and you reap the benefits. And I thought, yeah, she really did. She worked her knuckles to the bone. So yeah, but you were asking about the difference between a biography, you know, a historian and a novelist. And there is, I should say, there's a fantastic biography, joint biography of these two by Lindy Woodhead called War Paint, and that came out in 2003. And I found that through my Googling around and read it. But Lindy Woodhead, you know, can only report the facts as a biographer. And I jump between the gaps in the facts, and there are loads and loads of gaps. For example, Lindy Woodhead doesn't know, none of us actually know for sure, what products of each other's they copied, which advertising campaigns. When I'm writing that as a novel, I have to fictionalize it. So I have to be specific. I have to give them all the thoughts and feelings and dialogue that I do in the novel. And there were big gaps in the narrative, so I felt quite entitled in this case to leap in there and make things up that worked in terms of, you know, that still made them emotionally plausible as characters. But yeah, when I'm writing, I mean, I've written a novel, for example, about Jackie Kennedy and Maria Callas, Jackie and Maria, which came out in 2020, and their lives are covered in such detail by so many biographers that it was much harder. I didn't really have any wiggle room to fictionalize. But with Elizabeth and Helena, there's big gaps, and I leapt into them and waved my little magical author's wand that I keep here.
I love that. And I love, you know, exploring those gaps too, because I think, you know, especially when you are writing about people who had very public images and probably worked very hard to present a particular image, that gives you a lot of space to play with, like with, you know, reality versus image, or what was behind the performance for the public, you know?
Yeah. I mean, illusion is kind of a theme in the novel, because both Elizabeth and Helena were pretending to be something they weren't. Elizabeth was brought up in Canada, in Woodbridge, Ontario, the daughter of a tenant farmer, ridiculously poor. I mean, really scraping for vegetables in the soil and hand-me-down clothes from her siblings. And she was determined. She got a job in a beauty salon in New York with all these glamorous, wealthy women coming in. And she didn't just want to treat them, she wanted to be them. She reinvented herself. She changed her name. She changed her accent. She changed her appearance and tried to pass herself off as an upper-class New York woman, which clearly she wasn't. And you know, for the real wealthy classes in those days, she would never quite be accepted because she worked in trade, for goodness sake. Helena was also pretending to be something she wasn't. She claimed she'd started her business in Australia, having left the family home in Poland, where they were also, her father was a kerosene salesman, and there were 8 daughters, so they weren't wealthy either. And she came to Australia to stay with some relatives and reinvented herself there. And she claimed that she'd studied medicine at Krakow University, that she'd studied skincare under top European specialists. All of this was untrue. And she also claimed that a skin cream that she imported from Poland was made from anti-aging Carpathian herbs. Nobody has ever been able to track down these Carpathian herbs, she claimed. And in fact, she soon started making her own creams, and there's no evidence of her importing Carpathian herbs at all. But this was all, you know, it was all the marketing. So they've both got this big image that they're trying to promote, and it's not true. And of course, makeup itself is an illusion. We put it on and we become more confident and possibly more outgoing as we have this mask to hide behind. So yeah, the novel is definitely about illusion on one level.
Absolutely. And forgive me if this seems tangential for a second, but it will come back. I used to study medieval history, which I may have mentioned last time. And something I got really interested in was medieval cosmetic culture, because so much of it came from the Arab world. And so much of it was about, just like you were saying, about obscuring class origins or ethnic origins, or making yourself look like someone who you are not in order to fit into new social spaces, you know?
Mm.
And so I love how that, you know, that hundreds and hundreds of years later is sort of still at work, that like these class conscious women who have moved through the ranks are reinventing
Yeah.
themselves with the aids of their own, you know, products and
Yeah.
messaging.
Oh, absolutely. And not just class, of course, because makeup has been, you know, used with race as well. I think this started in 19th century with women trying to whiten their skin and look lighter than they were born. And yeah, that's another, you know, not very admirable aspect of the cosmetic industry, I guess.
I'd love if you could talk a little bit about writing on this sort of like epic time scale, you know, of a lifetime over decades. Because it occurred to me as I was reading that, you know, I always think of, or I have perhaps thought of character building and world building as something that you maybe do once in a novel. But when you are writing something that takes place over an entire person's lifespan and many historical periods, you are character building and world building over and over again, you know? And so when you are tracing women's lives over the course of an entire lifespan, how do you like achieve that balance of like the way a person grows and transforms over an entire life with like that sort of kernel of consistency or identity? I'm not quite sure if I'm getting the question
Yeah,
coherent.
no, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, writing biographical fiction, it's completely different from what a biographer does. So we're not trying to get down everything that's happened to them in their lives or every aspect of their lives by any means whatsoever. The first thing that I'm really looking for when I'm doing my research is a story arc that I can pull out. And in the case of Elizabeth and Helena, it really was the arc was about their rivalry. And I've covered 3 decades from 1915 to 45, roughly. And, you know, everything that, I mean, I cover their marriages as well, but everything else that wasn't really relevant to the feud, either I cut or my editor made me cut in the editing stages, because you need a novel to keep a certain amount of focus. But as you say, when you're covering different time periods, you can create a world quite economically in a novel with just a couple of scenes, a few brush strokes here and there. I don't write with great big long passages of description, but if I come upon, sometimes, I mean, in Manhattan Girls, for example, I remember as one character was running down a street, you know, I looked at the billboards that she ran past, which were particularly 1920s, and just a tiny detail like that can set the scene for you. You're just looking for brush strokes rather than an entire oil painting of each scene, I guess, is the answer.
Mhm. Well, that's so interesting. Thank you so much for joining us. Is there any thing that you're able to say about what you're working on or what's on the horizon? I know that sometimes authors are not at liberty to talk about these things, but you know, what's going on for you right now?
My next novel is going to be out next summer, and I can't tell you the subject yet because there are certain legal implications about it, but I'm jumping to the 1960s, which in my mind, is always, at the 20s and the 60s are just 2 of my favorite decades to write about, because they seem to me decades in which there were fundamental changes in society, when kids were rebelling against their parents, when things moved on, you know, at the end of the, you know, beginning of the 1920s, women have got the vote, you know, they've got so much more freedom, they're starting to have careers, they don't necessarily need a man to marry a man to get money. And then in the 1960s, goodness, we've got free love coming along and miniskirts, and it's just, and the pill obviously was the big game changer in the 1960s as well. So both of these decades I've always really loved. I've written the 1960s before with my Jackie and Maria novel, and it was great fun to go back there again. So yeah, I don't have a publication date for that one, but it'll be next August, September, I reckon.
That sounds
If the
fascinating.
lawyers agree.
Well, I hope they do, and I hope you get to come, you know, come and talk about that one too. I
I'd
think you're
love
absolutely
to.
right about the 20s and the 60s, because they're both like extraordinarily turbulent times, but also like moments of great optimism too, and sort of potential. And that's such an interesting kind of historical moment to explore.
And music and glamour and fashion, a lot of changes in the fashion as well. And I love dipping into these eras. Although it's, I'm of an age where I think 60s, is that really historical? But I'm told it is.
I'm not comfortable with that either. Any of the 20th century. I remember I grade papers sometimes, and one of my students recently wrote in the late 1900s, and I'm like, no, that's not a historical period. You can't say that. Just say 1990s.
It doesn't sound right, does it? No, I'm with you.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us. This has been really lovely. And yeah, I'm always happy to read your books and talk to you about them.
Oh, thank you. It's been great fun. Thanks a lot.
You're so welcome. Listeners, please check out A Beautiful Rival. It is so interesting and so much fun. And you will get to know two really extraordinarily interesting and complicated and influential women. So please check it out. Thanks so much for joining us. And it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.